Okay, so we are here today. I have a really great person who I want to introduce you guys to talk to about a pretty wonky subject. I say I say wonky, but this is a timely topic. You are hearing it in the news all of the time. I've got Professor David Willms on with me. Many of you have probably, if you read and listen to the same types of things that we do, wildlife, sportsman's issues, environmental issues, you have definitely heard David's name before, because he would never tell you this, but I'm going to tell you this. If you ask around enough, you are going to repeatedly hear that David Willms is an expert on all things ESA. So, David is the Associate Vice President of Public Lands for the National Wildlife Federation, which is an NGO that I know very, very well and have a great amount of respect for, being one of the former CEOs of the Mississippi Wildlife Federation. Still work with them. They do amazing, amazing work across North America. He is also an adjunct professor at the University of Wyoming Hobbs School of Environment and Natural Resources up in Wyoming. So I have a tremendous amount of respect for David. David is also just a really cool guy. So you would not think he would be so smart and so cool, but he also is. He's a hunter. And he has delved into these issues for decades, although he looks a lot younger than someone who would have been involved in these issues for so long. So David and I are both attorneys, so we will try not to talk like attorneys today, because there's a lot going on right now with the ESA. So I'm going to ask David to talk about both the history of the ESA and kind of what led to its introduction 50 years ago, because it's been 50 years now. And then this brand new bill that has been introduced. It was introduced on March 6th by Chairman Bruce Westerman, the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee. And he was joined by a number of co-sponsors on the Natural Resources Committee from all across the country, different areas in the country, north, south, east, west. And what this amendment, this ESA Amendments Act entails. So David, welcome.
I feel like we should just wrap up this podcast right now because you said so many nice things. I want to get out while the getting's good, but I really appreciate you having me.
Yeah. No, I want you to educate me and educate everyone listening today. We talked for just a very brief minute or two before we started this episode about how this bill was introduced, and the full name of the act, and it's House Bill 1897. The full name of the act is the Endangered Species Act Amendments Act. And you mentioned that the bill itself is longer than the original bill, right?
Yeah, I mean, so I was looking at it, and I think you may have told me that it was 44 pages of the bill, and I'm sitting here holding a copy of the original act that I've printed that I just carry with me, and it's 41 pages.
That you just carry with you.
Well,
I love that.
When you said I was an adjunct, I've taught a class for years on the Endangered Species Act, and so I always have my. It's starting to fall apart. I need to restaple it, but maybe print off a new copy. But I always have a copy of the act at arm's reach.
I love that. So some people carry a copy of the Constitution. Some people carry a copy of the Bible. You carry a copy of the Endangered Species Act.
I do. Yeah, I do.
Well, that's fantastic. And that is exactly why I have you on today. So can you walk us through the advent of the ESA?
Yeah. Now, I'll tell you, when I teach this class, this is about 3 lectures to do this. We're going to condense this down into a few minutes. But, it really came about because of some precipitous declines of some of our more iconic species that you would think about. Think about manatees and whooping cranes and gray wolves and grizzly bears and American alligators and California condors. And you can continue this list, right? There were people were thinking and noticing these iconic species. And the first act actually passed in 1966. This is called the Endangered Species Preservation Act.
Mm-hmm.
And I laugh about this when I talk about it, because we know today how slowly Congress can move on things, right? They passed this thing and they very, very quickly realized that it has no teeth. It's pretty much voluntary. It doesn't cover enough species. And so, like 3 years later, in 1969, they pass another law, the Endangered Species Conservation Act, which adds some additional teeth to this. It adds additional species that can be included, like crustaceans and mollusks, instead of just mammals, fish, birds, and amphibians. It expanded conservation to an international level for species that were in danger of worldwide extinction. And it sort of set the framework for the bill we operate under today. But after operating under that for a couple of years, folks started to realize this one isn't as effective as it should be either. And one of the main goals is we wanted to cut off, end the decline of species and try and prevent extinction, right? So in 1973, so we're talking the third bill in like 7 years passed by Congress to deal with endangered species, building off of prior versions that they just felt didn't quite hit the mark, and they replaced it with these new ones. So in 1973, they passed what we know now as the Endangered Species Act. It passed, and this is the part I always love to tell people, because you see all that partisan bickering today and party line votes on nominees and and bills, and it's hard to find bipartisanship. It passed the Senate unanimously, and it passed the House 390 to 12. And it was
amazing.
It's pretty amazing, right? And since that time, it's actually arguably become one of the most powerful laws for species protection, not just in the United States, but in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it does have international implications. And can you just explain to people why it doesn't just affect American species?
Yeah, and this is always interesting because you can list. In fact, I actually checked today before we were recording to get an updated tally. But globally, there are 705 species listed outside of the United States under the Endangered Species Act. And people would ask, well, what kind of authority do we have as a sovereign to list a species in another country, right? And how can that have any impact? Well, the idea behind this is economic in a lot of ways, right? There's a lot of commerce that moves between countries, and if we list something and make it illegal for our citizens to import parts of animals, for example, into this country, or plant species or whatever happens to be listed, if we make that illegal, then it means that less people are going to be interested in going to those places and potentially pursuing some of those animals. Some of them might be more charismatic, huntable species, for example.
Right.
So if they're listed and we prohibit bringing parts back into the country, then that can have impacts in those nations on how they do conservation.
Right.
They recognize the economic impact it might have. So it's a lever of influence.
Yeah. And so this act was passed in the early 70s when we were arguably at a very, very critical time, both in the United States and the world, in terms of a number of level of our species. Take, for example, the American alligator. It was, on the version of extinction back then. And it has been one of the success stories of the ESA. But we do have a number of species that have, I guess you would have classified them as success stories, but they've never been delisted. The American alligator was actually delisted within 20 years. Within our lifetime, not my lifetime, but there are still people alive today who were alive then that have seen the full recovery of the American alligator. But other species that the species population density has shown have been recovered are still on the list. Can you explain that?
Oh, if I could. Look, I think the Endangered Species Act has been one of the most successful laws out there for recovering species. Right? And before I go too much farther, there's one thing that always bothers me a little bit, and I'm guilty of this. I used to do this because in a prior life, I worked for a governor and we worked on endangered species issues. And there are political talking points that both sides of the aisle use. And I always used the talking point of, well, the Endangered Species Act, only at the time I was doing it, it was 1% of species have ever been delisted due to recovery. Now it's about 3%, right? Mm-hmm. And I always used that as a talking point to say, that's evidence that it's maybe not working as well as it could. And then we point to species like where I live, like grizzly bears, that we thought should be delisted but are still on there. I've kind of refined my thinking on this over the years as I've dived more and more into the mechanics of the act and what's working and what's not working. And I view those as just absolute political talking points, and I throw them out the window. People use them. They're going to continue to use them. But I think you have to look at different metrics. Like grizzly bears, for example, is a great one because the recovery rate on grizzly bears are one of the slowest reproducing mammals in North America. They just are. So you can't expect, like American alligator, which reproduces much faster. You can't expect a 20-year recovery for grizzly bears like you might be able to for American alligators. So one of the things you have to look at is, were there recovery plans put in place for these species? And are the species meeting the metrics under those recovery plans? Are they moving towards being able to be recovered and delisted? Sometimes it could be 5 years. Sometimes it could be 50 years. Sometimes, like frankly, with things like black-footed ferret, they may never get to the point where they're delisted, but they're still a conservation success story because they went from being believed to be extinct to now having thousands in the wild and in captivity and a successful breeding program. Right. So I always like to talk about, like, let's take the politics out of it and talk about how is it actually working. Now, the challenge with something like grizzly bears is it is a gigantic conservation success story. It's particularly in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and the Northern Continental Divide around Glacier National Park. Look, they have in the Yellowstone area, like I'm in Wyoming, like this is a thing I've been watching for my whole life, right? They went from being listed, there were about 137 bears, and today there are over 1,000.
Yeah.
Like, and they've expanded.
That's unbelievable. That to me is
incredible,
just amazing.
Right? Yeah. It's incredible.
Yeah. But you can't, like you said, comparing grizzlies to alligators to ferrets is comparing apples to oranges to bananas. I mean, like you have to look at each species within the species recovery plan individually. And you're right. I mean, one problem that I see, not with the ESA itself, but with the entire dialogue around the ESA, is that it has become this polarizing legislation that both sides of the aisle have just decided sort of what they want to do, or someone's told them this is what you should do, and you do hear these same talking points over and over and over. I mean, I will just put this out there. My own personal belief about the Endangered Species Act is that it has been an unbelievably phenomenal tool in species recovery. I think it's wonderful. I think that it could be better. And that's what I'll say. It's not that it's got all these horrible, awful flaws. It's that after having had this bill in effect for 50 years, we have now had time to look at it and say, okay, all right, we've seen some things. We've seen all these things that have worked. We've seen some things that maybe haven't worked quite so great. And here are some ways that we could make this work better and more efficiently and help some of these species recover and maybe be delisted. And maybe some won't ever, but let's, make the tweaks to help it keep on trucking in an even better manner. I mean, we do that all of the time with different pieces of legislation. So why not this one? Why do you think? So this new bill that was introduced, it's got a lot of support right now. On the Republican side, I mean, just in the last week, we've had 20 co-sponsors sign on. I just pulled the list and look, some really strong members, but I haven't seen a Democrat sign on yet. This to me should be a bipartisan issue. I mean, so why is it not yet? I'm hoping that it will become bipartisan. So
yeah, it used to be, that point that you made about amending bills, like as we learn how to do better. we have a track record of this. We actually have a track record of this with the Endangered Species Act. I mean, it was passed in 1973. It was amended in 78, 82, 88. I think there might have been one or two other tweaks in there. Those were the major amendments, and they were in response to something. Like they learned something. And sometimes they made a change. And actually, one of the changes they made in 1982, has actually led to a lot of the problems we're dealing with today, right? And, it's
Which was that? Can you talk about that change?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 1982, leading up to that, one of the big issues is that somebody would submit a petition to list a species, which is there's a process under the Act to do this, right? Either the Fish and Wildlife Service can do this on their own accord, or somebody can. And when I say somebody, I mean you or I could do it. An NGO could do it. A state could do it. Anybody can do this. Submit a petition to list a species, and then the Fish and Wildlife Service would analyze that petition and analyze the species and make a determination on whether or not it warrants listing. There were no timelines before 1982. So a petition would come in, and sometimes they'd just sit on it and nothing would happen. And they could sit on it for years. And Congress said, this doesn't make sense. We have an act for a reason. And if a species is truly imperiled, it should probably be listed, right? And so they put a process in with deadlines in 1982. And they just kind of randomly, out of thin air, like if you can go back and look at this, and there's just not a lot of rhyme or reason or explanation, they picked 12 months. It was sort of a year should be enough, right? A year should be enough. And what we have found out since then, particularly in that, I'd say the 1998 to about 2010 timeframe, when you had a handful of environmental groups recognize the limitations of the Fish and Wildlife Service from a staffing perspective, a resource perspective. They knew that they could submit hundreds of petitions at one time to list species, and the service would be overwhelmed by that and wouldn't have the resources to address those. They would miss that 12-month deadline, and then those environmental groups could then sue for violating the firm deadline in the Act, and they'd win every time. And it wasn't necessarily, I've heard some people say, well, it was about, sue and settle and getting paid. And it wasn't really about getting paid as much as it was about controlling the workload of the Fish and Wildlife Service, directing the species that should be listed, where, when. And so they had all these settlements, and the workload of the Fish and Wildlife Service was dictated by the courts in these massive species settlement issues. And that was all a function of an amendment in 1982 that was made for the right reasons, like they needed to respond to something real. And now fast forward, and 40 years later, 43 years later, we're seeing that, there are consequences from that amendment that might make sense to address, right? And so that's kind of my point, is they used to do it, and then they just stopped, and it became this third rail, like this untouchable law that put people into real political corners. And not just because of that issue, but because of a number of different issues. And now it's become almost this untouchable issue. It's just really, really, really difficult.
Does that still happen? I mean, do environmental groups still flood with petitions and then sue?
Well, so here's the thing, and this is going a beautiful segue into the bill, right? Into Representative Westerman's bill. So towards the end of the Obama administration, one of the things that happened in response to one of these sue and settles was that the Fish and Wildlife Service put together a national listing work plan. And what that was is a policy for them internally for how to prioritize the petitions they received, so that the species that were of the highest concern would be dealt with in that 12-month time frame, would be dealt with fastest. And maybe somewhere states and tribes and local governments and others were doing a lot of on-the-ground conservation, and there were chances to prevent the need to list in the first place, they might put that as a lower priority species for addressing the petition. And they gave themselves a time frame to handle these petitions, but they put them in these bins, and there were 5 of them, right? And the environmental groups actually signed off on that and said they'd stand down and let this approach try to work. And it's actually worked remarkably well because, oddly enough, if you let the Fish and Wildlife Service prioritize petitions based upon science and need, they have the expertise to know how to do that. And they can triage this and actually manage things pretty well. And I think everybody I've talked to on both sides of the aisle, in the environmental community, in the ag community, in industry, like, they all think this has worked pretty well. And it's one of the pieces included in Representative Westerman's bill, is to really formalize by statute that national listing work plan, because without it, right now, technically, by operating under that plan, they're technically violating the law because they're taking more than 12 months. And at any point, these groups could decide we're going to challenge that, right?
Right. So right now, it's basically a handshake agreement that they're not going to be sued if they work in this priority plan manner. And Westerman's bill codifies this into law.
That's right. And it's the second bill. This is the second attempt at codifying this into law. Senator Barrasso from Wyoming tried to do this in 2019 or 2020 with a bill that's, there's some overlap, some synergy between these two bills, right? Mm-hmm. And that was one of the provisions in that one as well. And it's been something that I think there's actually pretty broad support for that, right?
Right. Because this bill did not come out of nowhere. I mean, there have been a lot of people working on this for a long time.
That's right.
Republicans and Democrats and environmental groups and wildlife groups, and a lot of input went into this bill from experts.
Yeah, and it's sort of, you build off of lessons learned from prior efforts. And that one with Senator Barrasso, for example, is one that I was very, very involved in. I worked for the governor of Wyoming at the time, and we worked closely with the Western Governors Association at that time. He was the chair of the Western Governors Association, and we worked with governors and across the West, and we worked with groups, different interests from all over the country, to put together recommendations for how we could improve not just the statutory side, but the implementation through the regulation as well of the Endangered Species Act. And it led to a number of ideas that served as, I would say, the core of Senator Barrasso's bill. And some of those themes have carried over into Representative Westerman's bill as well. And they were built off of a multi-year effort that involved facilitated professional facilitators, working through dialogue. And me, I stepped into a facilitation role, and I am not a professional facilitator, but by any means. But we all kind of worked together on this.
Right. Okay, so we mentioned the success story of the American alligator recovery and delisting. You mentioned that did you say it was up to 3% or up to 5%? 3%?
That have been delisted due to recovery. Mm-hmm. So it's up to 3%, but it kind of depends on the math on all this. Gets squishy because it's, are you talking of all species listed, just U.S. species listed,
or a subspecies, or
DPSs, or all that. So
but
2 to 3%, 2 to 3%.
Yeah. So before we get into a few of the specifics of the bill and a few of the proposed amendments, I'd like to talk about one species that has, and I'm not even going to say arguably, because the science has shown that it has recovered. We're going to talk about, but it has not been delisted. Let's talk about the wolves. Let's talk about the gray wolves. They had actually been delisted both under the Obama administration and then the first Trump administration. So we're talking about a Democrat administration and then a Trump administration, right? But now they're listed again. And let's take Wisconsin. So because Tom Tiffany is one of the sponsors of this, and he is just an adamant, very vocal supporter of this act. And his reasoning basically stems because of what has gone on with the gray wolf. That state's management plan that was initially put into place in 1999 and then updated in 2007, the target population for recovery was set at 350. And we know today that they have over 1,000 wolves. So they're over 3 times their initial target population, and yet they remain listed as endangered. So what do you think and what is possibly in why has that continued to happen, and what in this new bill could possibly prevent something like that from happening? Because I don't think a lot of people understand. Like, we are constantly hearing about wolves here, wolves there. Why, they were delisted in Montana, they were delisted in Idaho. Why are they listed here? Like, it's just been this, and we hear about them being introduced into the state. They've been brought down from Canada. I mean, it's just this ongoing onslaught of wolves, 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 especially on social media. Can you kind of walk us through wolves?
Oh man, can I? How much time do you have?
No, no.
Yeah, right?
Honestly, we need to do an entire episode just on wolves. But
Yeah.
I'd love to do it after there's a solution to it. I don't know that there ever will be, but I think the amendments in this act can help. But just for right now, walk me through what you have seen and what you think could help.
Yeah. So again, being in Wyoming, I've lived wolves for a long time. Wolves were reintroduced in Wyoming when I was in early high school, right? So it's like, and then they just exploded, right? So they were reintroduced in Yellowstone and then in central Idaho and just took off. And they've become a focal point of my career as well, along with grizzly bears and
I've
other
seen the
things.
wolves in Yellowstone. I mean, I've seen some, and they're amazing to watch. They're cool.
They're
Wolves
incredible.
Cool.
Yeah, they're incredible, right? The thing is, here's where it gets a little complicated. So there have been in this area, and then we'll talk about the Western Great Lakes. In the Northern Rockies, there were, between the two, there have been over 10 attempts to delist wolves, right? So there's that tells you it's not a Fish and Wildlife Service problem necessarily, because Fish and Wildlife Service has recognized that populations have hit recovery goals and that they, in their belief, there were adequate regulatory mechanisms in place at the state level to ensure that upon delisting, wolves would remain recovered for the foreseeable future. That's the test. If you're going to delist, that's what you have to show. One of the things you have to show. So they're saying this exists. So they tried many iterations of delisting. So when you hear stories about, well, in Montana and Idaho, they were delisted. Well, that was a situation where Wyoming wanted to do this dual classification, where in part of the state they were classified as trophy animals that would have a regulated hunting season and really strictly managed. And the rest of the state, they would be classified as a predator species, which meant from a social standpoint, they just weren't going to jive with the rest of the state, and we just didn't want them there. And so there were more aggressive management plans in place to effectively to manage them as close to zero as possible in
closer
big
to a
parts of the
nuisance
state.
species.
Yeah, exactly.
Not quite that extreme.
Yeah, but in the recovery area, they were going to be managed very strictly and with quotas and with population targets and so forth. The Fish and Wildlife Service at first didn't like that approach. They didn't like it. So they decided they were going to move forward with trying to delist wolves in Montana and Idaho on their own. And so they drew this line to delist them in those two states and not Wyoming. And a court said, you can't do that, because if you're going to create a distinct population segment, it has to be along biological boundaries, not geopolitical boundaries. And so you can't use a state line for it. Well, that
kind of makes sense.
It does make a lot of sense, right? I mean, the service was trying to get creative. They didn't like what Wyoming was doing, but they thought these other two states shouldn't be punished for what they thought Wyoming was doing wrong. So they do this, and the court says, no, you can't do this. And then sometimes you just have to have fortuitous timing on things. And Senator Tester was up for re-election in a very contentious year, and you had a number of Democrats in the upper Midwest that were looking at what was happening there and thinking, in the Great Lakes state, thinking, well, we want to delist wolves here. We may need a similar solution. So through a budget rider process, Senator Tester successfully attached a rider to reinstate that delisting rule for those two states and make it not subject to judicial review. So Congress intervened in that instance, and it just happened to be this convergence of the right politics at the right moment, where Democrats, Tester needed this for re-election. Democrats needed Tester. Upper Midwestern, Western Great Lakes states had their own wolf issues to deal with, so they thought they might need this. So everything converged at this one point, and they were congressionally delisted. Then fast forward a few years, and ultimately Wyoming won some litigation about this dual classification system, and they were allowed to do it. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service moved forward with delisting that. And so now you have a delisted, and that actually, by the way, survived judicial review. And it's, of all the 10 or so delisting attempts, it's the only attempt to survive judicial review, that where a court ultimately put the stamp of approval and said, yep, this survives judicial review and this delisting rule can stay in effect. So then they were delisted in Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, and the Panhandle of Utah. So all of those are delisted, and they all remain delisted today and have for years and under state management.
Okay.
Right? Then you have the Western Great Lakes issue, the Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan issue,
yeah.
right? And some of the issues there are now becoming some of the issues around grizzly bears too. And it all, in my opinion, ties back to this policy that the Fish and Wildlife Service adopted in 1995, 1996, this distinct population segment policy. So wolves are an interesting deal because, remember, I said the ESA has been amended a few times. Well, in 1982, the definition of species was amended to include a distinct population segment. Could be its own species. So you didn't have to list nationwide or range wide for a species. You could actually draw a line on a map and just list a subset of a population that might be imperiled versus everything. Well, wolves didn't fall under that. I'm getting really wonky here, and I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Yeah, no, it's okay.
But wolves didn't fall under that. They were listed before this rule change, right? So that statutory change happens in 1982, and then a policy is written in the mid-90s to implement that change, to say, okay, here's what a distinct population segment is. And part of that is you have to have discreteness from other populations. So it has to be so genetically isolated as to not have a lot of interconnectivity between other populations of the same species. So one of the issues in the Western Great Lakes states is you have wolves that have been moving out of those states into other places, right? Mm-hmm. And the question is, how do you address those remnant populations? And if you delist that Western Great Lakes population, if you delist that, what do you end up doing with, like, how do you delist all of these other wolves in other places? And it's an issue we're going to face in the West as well, is with this distinct population segment policy, is these populations in California are connected to delisted populations, for example. And so you can't create a new distinct population segment. So right now, the only way to delist wolves in a large part of the country because of that population is you have to delist them everywhere.
Yeah.
You really do. And then the question is, are they truly recovered everywhere, or everywhere they should be? And that's the big debate. Like, that's the back and forth. And so it's just
super complicated.
It's super, it's way more complicated than politicians or the media make it out to be. It's super complicated.
And that's the same situation going on with grizzly bears, correct?
Yes. Yeah, it is. So grizzly bears, there have been multiple attempts to delist grizzly bears, 2 attempts to delist grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And both times the federal district court and then the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals found some reason why that proposed delisting rule was insufficient and reinstated the listing rule, putting the protections back in place.
Because we know the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals knows everything that they need to know about.
They seem to.
Science.
they seem to. I've been in the camp for a long, long time that particular population has more than recovered. It's at the point where it's busting into new places. They haven't been seen in 100 years. You talk to some of the biologists there, they'll tell you that really they're about as close as you can be to carrying capacity, and which is why you're seeing them move into other places where they've never been before. Right. They're out on the plains. They're moving multiple mountain ranges over. They're dispersing
more human wildlife conflict.
Yeah, more conflict, more fatalities in the past decade than there were in the 30 years combined prior. There's a lot of conflict, but there were petitions to delist from all 3 states that have bears, the Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, all submitted 3 different petitions to delist grizzly bears. And the Fish and Wildlife Service did something a little bit, I'll just say it was unique, right? In it's something maybe you could have seen it coming, but I maybe didn't see it coming quite this way, which was they reclassified grizzly bears. So what they're proposing, they have a proposed rule out there. What they're proposing to do is to say everywhere in the country except this area, we're delisting them. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, but in this particular area, in the Western United States, we're going to reclassify them as threatened, and we're going to reclassify them as one meta population and large distinct population segments. So there are 6 recovery zones for grizzly bears, and this new DPS would encompass all of those recovery zones and everything in between them. And it runs from, almost the North Dakota border. It encompasses almost all of Montana, 2/3 of Wyoming, 3/4 of Idaho, and good chunks of eastern Washington, all the way to the Cascades as well, if this were to be adopted. And it arguably could mean that if you now have to recover this entire meta population, you could be looking at decades, like literal decades, that the bears have to stay on the list to meet what might be new recovery objectives. They also did one other thing, which is they created what's called a 4D rule to accompany this reclassification. And it does give some additional flexibilities for management for landowners to deal with conflict bears and for state agencies. But I do know there's some concerns from some landowners about some liability issues even under that 4D rule.
And where is that in the process? Is that under public comment right now? What is?
It is. Public comment had been open for 60 days. It was just extended for another 60 days. I think it closes sometime in mid-May now. So it's open for comment, and then the Fish and Wildlife Service will review comment. And they have a year from the time that they published that proposed rule in early January until they have to make a final up or down determination on that rule. So
and then there'll be litigation.
Oh, of course there will. It's consistent as gravity. Right?
So talking about the litigation, I think that we can move into, let's talk about a few components of this bill, because one of them is very specific to the litigation situation, and not the one we talked about earlier necessarily. But just maybe let's just walk through a few of the kind of main focal points of this bill. One of the goals, it seems, of this Amendments Act is to put more of the, I don't want to say power because that's not the right word, but to give states and local officials and tribal jurisdictions more of, I guess, a hand or more I guess more power in enacting their own recovery plans within their jurisdictions. I'm not phrasing that very well, but you probably know exactly how to phrase it.
Yeah. So as I said at the beginning, when you strip the politics away and see what works and doesn't work, what we do know about species recovery is that if a species has a recovery plan in place, that in nearly every case, when you have a recovery plan with goals set in place, species are moving towards those recovery objectives. They're trending the right direction. It's the ones that are in purgatory. Like 18% of all listed species in the United States don't even have a recovery plan. Now that's an improvement from 10 years ago where it was closer to 30%, but you still have several hundred, at least a couple hundred species listed that don't have a recovery plan. And in some instances, they can go 20 years on the list before they even get a recovery plan. So you don't even know the pathway to recovery. They just sit there in purgatory, right? You don't even have a roadmap to recovery. So one of the things that I think does have some broad appeal is if you can create incentives or facilitate more local control, taking a hand in species recovery at an earlier stage to help write a recovery plan and lead a recovery implementation team. Look, still in coordination with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Secretary of Interior's office. But if you can do that and get a plan in place a lot faster and move towards implementing it, we have a lot of data that shows you'll move a lot faster towards actually recovering and delisting species, which, by the way, we talk about preventing extinction, but one of the main goals of the ESA is also to facilitate the recovery of a species to the point where the protections of the act are no longer required.
So
Right?
is that a goal under the existing act? I mean, does it have objective species recovery goals? Do
No.
you have to have that under the existing act?
No, you can do recovery plans, but it's not. I think this bill, helps. Like the provisions of this bill could potentially help facilitate. It doesn't mandate, right? This is that states that want to do this, states that want to lead recovery planning processes and want to write the recovery plans could be empowered to do so. And arguably, you could probably do that without a statutory change, right? But by making it a statutory change, it becomes really the policy of Congress to say, look, states should be really engaged, active participants in the recovery planning and implementation process. And so, there's a lot of potential there.
Don't you think that the entire objective of the act should be to recover and delist species?
Well, I think it should be twofold. I think I think it's a safety net. I think you need to catch them before they circle the drain and fall out, right?
Right.
So the first step is catching them, and the second point is setting them free, right? So catching them and then recovering them and delisting them. And sometimes we get caught in the let's catch them. And to be fair, the resources available for the Fish and Wildlife Service to implement the Endangered Species Act, especially when adjusted for inflation, have decreased pretty substantially over the past 30, 40 years. And so it's another reason why a state partnership is really critical to do that second step of recovering and delisting. If all we're doing is putting them on the list, that list is just going to grow, and eventually it's going to collapse in on itself. It's just it's just going to fall under its own weight because you're not getting species off the list, right? And we have to be honest about that.
So, over the last 50 years, we have seen groups sue to prevent species from being downgraded or delisted. This new act has some provisions in there that would at least maybe, I don't know about halting completely, but at least maybe slowing that down, right?
I'm going to push back on you just a little bit, and it's only because about a year ago I wrote a chapter for a book that was the ESA at 50 was effectively what it is, and looking forward for the next 50 years about the Endangered Species Act. So I
didn't know that, or I would have mentioned that. Introduced you.
So I was a contributing author to this, and one of the things I was researching was the litigation piece, because because in Wyoming it felt like we were always facing these litigation challenges with grizzly bears and wolves and Preble's meadow jumping mice and we
read about it all the time. We always
read about it all the time.
lawsuits.
So I wanted to get some actual data, like how often does this actually happen, right? And right now we have 79 species that have been delisted due to recovery. When I wrote this book chapter, it was 71. And at that time, there were really only, in fact, I might even just point out a sentence or two here. Only 5 of those 71 were judicially challenged. So when people think that there's just constant litigation over delistings, it's actually 5: gray wolves, Louisiana black bear, Steller sea lions, Northern Virginia flying squirrel, bald eagles. Each of those species are delisted with the exception of wolves. And then there were 3 others that had been proposed for delist. So gray wolves outside of the Northern Rockies, Greater Yellowstone population of grizzly bears, and Preble's meadow jumping mouse were proposed for delisting, and courts reinstated protections. So you have some where they were litigated.
Reinstated protections to somewhat not have to at least ask for an injunction to.
So what I guess what I'm saying is there were 5 that were judicially challenged where they prevailed, right? Where the service prevailed and then the species were delisted. You had 3 additional ones that were proposed for delisting and challenged and remain listed today, where they lost. And so all told, it's really about 10% of all species that have ever been proposed for delisting that result in litigation.
So maybe it's just to sue over and over and over about these same species.
The issue is the ones that we see are the most high profile, most charismatic, most controversial species. So most of the species that are delisted aren't controversial. So how is it that you deal with the ones that are, which are the things like grizzly bears, wolves, and evidently Preble's meadow jumping mouse,
right?
Which is the most charismatic mouse species out there.
Is it? I'm about to Google this thing right now.
Yeah.
It looks like.
But the only reason I wanted to push back on that is there's this narrative, and I fed into this narrative for years until I actually dived into the data that every time something is proposed for delisting, it's instantly litigated. And the truth is, most of the litigation is actually on the front end. Most of the litigation is on that petitions to sue and is addressed through and would be addressed through that incorporation of that national listing work plan. It's these handful of super charismatic, controversial species that make it seem like we're always in litigation over delisting, but it's really just a handful of species.
You think we're going to get some litigation over the whooping crane?
I mean, yes.
I foresee that percentage going up.
I can foresee situations, depending on the species, where that percentage could go up. Yes, it's not going to go away. Like if grizzly bears and wolves are somehow delisted and survive judicial review, people aren't going to throw their hands up and say, "Oh, we're done litigating." Right. There will be something else, but it's not going to be everything.
There are people who it really doesn't, and I think it may come down to just a philosophy, your environmental philosophy, but there are some people who just don't want to see their definition of a species recovery is different from other people's definition of a species recovery. They don't want them delisted for whatever reason. Maybe they don't want them to ever allow any sort of harvest season. Maybe they don't want for whatever reason. I mean, but it's probably not. I mean, I think that probably even though the parties may look and agree, okay, scientifically speaking, maybe this population is what we would consider recovered from a species density population statistical number, but like to some of these environmental groups, they just don't want them off the list. They want them permanently protected.
Yeah, and I'll get even more pointed with it. I think this is David Willms' theory that, and let's just use grizzly bears as an example. If one of two things happened, if Congress passed a law that, like a Grizzly Bear Protection Act, that prevented the hunting of grizzly bears, or if the states of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho passed constitutional amendments that prohibited the hunting of grizzly bears and incorporated it into their constitutions, grizzly bears would be delisted tomorrow,
right?
And they would survive judicial review.
I think you're right.
I deeply believe that, and when you look at the species that are most controversial, it boils down to
all of these species.
Lethal take.
Yes.
Like that's what it boils down to. Is and I don't want to say that's a blanket for everything, but for those charismatic ones, that's what it boils down to.
Wasn't there a state-sponsored culling of grizzly bears this year? Did I make that up? Like somewhere?
Yeah, you made that up. Yeah.
Nowhere there wasn't any. I thought they culled some grizzly bears for some reason in Alaska.
Well, I mean, there's every year there's some amount of conflict bears that are lethally removed from the population. So state wildlife agencies, in working with the Fish and Wildlife Service, will respond to conflict situations. And they'll try a relocation, and sometimes relocation doesn't work, and it's sort of a two-strike policy.
In Alaska, they killed 94.
Oh, they're not listed.
Brown bear. Okay, yeah,
they're not listed in Alaska.
They're not listed in Alaska. That's what. Okay, they're not listed, but they did. They did. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. But in the states where they're listed, no, they remove conflict bears. But here's an interesting one for you. This is going into the early days of the ESA thing. The original, and I'm sorry to focus so much on grizzly bears, but the original listing of grizzly bears came with what's called a 4D rule, and I talked about it a little bit earlier. It's Section 4D of the Endangered Species Act. It allows some flexible management and some relief from take of threatened species. Doesn't apply to endangered, but for threatened. And there was a 4D rule for grizzly bears that authorized the state of Montana to still have a grizzly bear hunt until, like, it was in effect until the mid 1990s.
Oh, okay. So,
like they were hunting
almost
a
up
listed
until
species.
they were delisted.
And 10 years shy,
10 years,
12. Yeah, their first time was like 2007. So, maybe 12 years before that. But there was a for the first 20 years of the act, there was a provision that allowed, and Montana did it periodically. They would have grizzly bear hunts outside of Glacier National Park while they were listed.
Okay.
Which I thought's interesting. Just an interesting tidbit.
That is interesting. No, I appreciate that. See, I'm learning so much on this. Okay. So what is the proposed amendment that would block environmentalists from suing to downgrade?
Yeah. Can I tell you the story behind this? I think I told you at one point the story behind this. Yeah. Like this one's my fault. Or
you think this may derail it, but like I really don't. I think there's something else that may derail it that I'd like to talk about in a minute.
Sure. Well, I think there's about a half a dozen things that'll derail it. but
maybe not. Look, maybe not.
No, I think there are about a half a dozen things that would, but there is a provision in Representative Westerman's bill, which is a carryover provision from Senator Barrasso's bill, which goes back to some recommendations that came out of this Western Governors Association process in the 2015 to 17 timeframe, which ultimately started in my favorite restaurant in Cheyenne with a friend of mine writing this down on the back of a napkin.
What is that restaurant, just for our interested listeners?
It doesn't exist anymore, but it was called Lil Philly's. It was a Philly-style cheesesteak place that was my favorite place to go in town.
Nice. Love cheesesteaks.
Yeah, it was good stuff. But we wrote this thing on the back end of a napkin, and it just sort of kept alive, and it's found its. And I don't want to say it's. I'm sure other people had the idea too, but I'm just like, this is where my origin story with it is. But anyway, it goes. It says there would be no litigation, no judicial review until the end of the post-delisting monitoring period. So when you delist a species, it doesn't just automatically, that's the end of the Fish and Wildlife Service's engagement with the state or with that species. Mm-hmm. A species is delisted, and for a period of time, usually 5 years, sometimes a little longer, sometimes it's 7. I think Louisiana black bear might have been a 7-year post-delisting monitoring period. There are annual reports provided to the Fish and Wildlife Service so they can monitor the progress and the implementation of the state's delisting management plan. And then after that post-delisting management plan period ends, then there's more separation. There's not the coordination doesn't have to be as close. You kind of lose some of that oversight, right? So the idea was, look, no species that's ever been delisted due to recovery has ever been relisted, absent a court order saying, relist this because you made some procedural error. But if it makes it through judicial review or it's never sued, no species that's ever been delisted due to recovery has ever been relisted. So our thought process when we were talking about this a decade ago was, first of all, the likelihood of them having to go back on the list is low because the states don't want to have to go through this process again. Like, it is a really burdensome thing to have a species listed in your state. Yeah. Right. And so it was.
And just so expensive. What a waste of resources.
Yeah, so much. Yeah, and they don't want to do it again, right?
And the litigation involved is so expensive and time consuming.
Yeah, so they put together these post-delisting management plans that are highly effective at keeping species recovered and keeping them from having to be relisted, to the point that it's never had to be done. So the thought was, okay, for some of these controversial species like grizzly bears and wolves, well, what if you delayed judicial review for 5 years to allow the state's post-delisting management plan to work? And if it was working and the species was still clearly recovered and doing well, then why would anybody want to waste a bunch of money suing over that delisting anymore? And by the way, there's still the backstop that if the species starts to precipitously fall, there's still two avenues to relist them, which is the Fish and Wildlife Service can use emergency provisions, or they can go through the standard order and procedure and go through a petition and all that sort of thing. So there's still these backstops on it. So that was our thought at the time a decade ago, and similar language is in Representative Westerman's bill.
And I think it's a fabulous provision. I previously asked you about the constitutionality of it, in which you have researched extensively, and it is legal.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And there's precedent, right? Like in other, didn't you say there was precedent somewhere else? Did I make that up too?
I'm not sure about that part. But,
all right, scratch that.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, but it is.
I feel certain there probably somewhere you have to wait a bit on judicial review, but maybe not. I don't know. But it just makes so much sense in a time where frivolous litigation wastes so much of our taxpayer resources and the listing process. So I think that's great. I'll tell you the one, and I would really want to hear your take on this before we have to go. And I know we're running up, we're getting close to an hour. So this is such an interesting and so important topic. So there's one of the amendments would prevent the Secretary of the Interior from designating privately owned or controlled land as critical habitat, which they say protects landowners' rights. So to me, that concerns me a little bit, because critical habitat is critical habitat to me. So how can you differentiate between public and private? I mean, now maybe some of the regulations would apply differently, but I mean, that to me is just a little bit concerning. Can you go into that a little? Why was that provision put in, and what's your take on it?
Yeah, I think that's going to be one of the more controversial provisions. I also would say I think that judicial review one is going to be one of the most, based on prior experience, it's going to be one of the most controversial provisions.
Okay.
But I think the critical habitat one will be one of the most controversial provisions. Part of that, I think part of the reason for it is landowners fear. They operate in this place of fear a lot, and sometimes justifiably so. If a species is listed and it's determined that critical habitat is their property,
right,
like this is right, it can raise your costs significantly to doing business on your own property.
But you can also get a lot of money for stuff like that, right? Don't people want to find gopher tortoises on their property?
It all depends on the species, for sure. Yeah, I think it all depends on the species. But I know that there's a lot of nervousness, and particularly because if you have critical habitat, then you've got to invest in habitat conservation plans, and you've got to go through and get incidental take permits, and there's an additional layer of regulatory pressure that's put on landowners. And so I know that there's nervousness there. On the flip side, right, if you're focusing resources on recovering a species in the places that are the most critical to it, like what's the habitat that's the most important to the recovery of that species, then it can be important to identify that. So I think it's going to be really, really controversial. One of the things that's in there that I'm guessing, I'm speculating a little bit, but one of the things they do is I think they try and create a few exceptions to this. It's not a blanket critical habitat can't be designated on private lands.
Right.
They're saying it can't be designated on private lands if there are these things in place. So say the state's working with the landowner on a big conservation plan or something like that, that maybe that would be an example of where they'd say, don't do a designation there.
And they also incentivize wildlife conservation on private lands. So, that's why I say that, and I think that may be one way to offset if that provision doesn't make it in there, which is what we do in so many aspects of conservation throughout America, make it voluntary conservation programs that you can reap benefits from and financial benefits to practice good conservation practices voluntarily, which could in this case happen if you do happen to have land that is designated critical habitat. I mean, look, conversely, think about somebody who happens to own property where CWD is found. I mean, they immediately have certain regulatory situations or that they're, they can't do certain things. And their property values tank. So, I mean, there's all sorts of situations that we could talk about that affect people who own private land. I mean, you own private land at your peril and also at your benefit. So, but I mean, I like the fact that this bill would create more transparency, more accountability. I mean, I feel like it would also push states to become much more involved in these species recovery plans. I mean, I think that there's a lot of really good things in this bill. I mean, what I'm hoping is that as they work toward markup, they can get some of the Democrats to come to the table, and that maybe some of the Republicans could give a little bit so that we could at least get some of the provisions through. Like you said, I mean, this has been amended several times over the decades, and I don't see that do you think it's an all or nothing type of thing? Have you talked to, I have not talked to House Natural Resources staff in the past week. I've been out of the country. So I have not gotten the inside scoop on this. I don't know, what the situation is on if there's any compromise to be had. You may know more than I do.
Yeah, I don't know how much I'm allowed to share.
Okay, I know.
But I mean, just generally speaking, like going all the way back to the beginning of this, I do think it is going to be very, very difficult to find a Democratic co-sponsor for a bill where the amendments are longer than the initial act, right? And I come back to that because it feeds into the narrative that you'll hear from some of saying this is trying to gut or blow up or destroy the ESA. That absolutely feeds into that narrative, and I think that's one of, if I were going to have a significant critique of my 20 years working on the ESA at the local, state, and national level, it would be that sometimes we bite off more than we should chew. Not maybe more than we can, but more than we should. And it's that in the case of ESA, less is going to be more. And the typical negotiation tactics in legislation where you throw in the kitchen sink and then negotiate a bunch of it away to get to where you want, I don't think that's a tactic that can work with the ESA. I think you actually have to focus on 1 to 3 very targeted things that you can actually demonstrate would provide uplift for species and would provide better functioning of the ESA and could provide benefit to people as well. Like, how can you need to focus on those things and then prove that is actually true, and then you can come back to the table with another ask. But you, like, overhauling this bill is, I don't think, possible, even in the current political climate.
So as we close out, let me ask you this. If you were going to pick the 1 to 3 things, and you can say, one thing or 2 things, what out of this bill that you would advance, what would it be? What do you think could have the greatest impact?
Well, there's what can pass and what I like. There might be 2 different things, right? So I'll go on the thing that I think can have the biggest impact, that could actually get some bipartisan support over the longer term. Okay. I'll point to 3, and I'll just start there. And one of them is the National Listing Work Plan. You want to reduce litigation and help the Fish and Wildlife Service manage its workload, incorporate the National Listing Work Plan into the act. 2 is, and maybe there's even 4, but 2 is the recovery planning process and finding ways to facilitate greater state engagement and involvement in that. Look, the act, when it was originally adopted, envisioned a partnership and a very strong stateside engagement to species recovery. That would be moving in the direction of, I think, fulfilling the initial intent of the act when it was originally drafted. 3, some of the conservation incentive programs, like improving how candidate conservation agreements with assurances are adopted, and making it a faster, less burdensome process for landowners, I think can be that's a really effective program, but it can be time consuming and
Faster would be
there are
great.
barriers to entry. Yeah.
They're so
And then
long.
the fourth one is, and this one might not get talked about as much, is this bill reauthorizes the Endangered Species Act and increases the funding for the implementation of it to like $25. And
Yeah, we didn't
that's
talk about that.
significant. It hasn't been reauthorized in decades, and it hasn't been funded at appropriate levels, maybe ever. And so, when you take that and those other three, like those are a few like real tangible things that I think would greatly has the potential to greatly improve implementation of the ESA and help with species recovery.
And you would think that that last point would at least get some people to cross the aisle.
Not with everything else that's in the bill.
Not with everything else. But look, I like your 4. I like your 4.
Yeah.
Hey, let's work on that. Let's get NWF and some of these other groups together and try to get those 4 across the finish line.
Yeah, and I should say that's my 4. That's David Willms' 4. That's not right. NWF's 4.
I know. I'm saying let's talk them into it.
That's me. That's my 4.
Let's talk them and DU and all the other groups and TNC and all the big ones, and let's CSF. Let's put together a plan and say, hey guys, let's get these things through. So everybody out there, Blood Origins, we thank you for being here today, David Willms. Thank you for all of your very, very good, very thorough, exceptional work on the ESA. I hope you continue to do the same thing you're doing for a lot longer. And I hope you come
appreciate
back
that
on our podcast.
Yeah, thanks. I'd love to come back. Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to.
All right. Awesome. We will talk to David Willms soon, and thank you guys for joining us. Have a good day.